She had the door open, bag on her shoulder, keys in her hand, coat on. The taxi she'd called was 7 minutes away. I know, because she'd said so. 7 minutes, when she came out of her room, and I had been counting without meaning to. The hallway light was on, the apartment light was off, and she was half in and half out, one hand on the doorframe, and she was not leaving. She said, "Unless." Just that. One word, trailing into nothing, like a sentence that had changed its mind at the last second. I said, "Unless what?" She said, "I don't know yet. I'm still deciding." I stood there in the dark of the apartment in the specific silence of midnight, and I waited. Because it seemed like the only thing to do, and also because she was standing in the door and I had not figured out, in the 6 minutes since she'd come out of her room with the bag, how to ask her not to go without it meaning something I hadn't decided to say yet. She had the cab. She had the bag. She had a flight in the morning to a city 2 time zones away, where she had a job offer she'd been sitting on for 3 weeks. And she had one word hanging in the doorframe that was either everything or nothing, and I did not yet know which. My name is Sam Holt. I'm 31. I teach community college mathematics, which is a job that requires a specific kind of patience. Not the patience of waiting, but the patience of watching someone work towards something they can't quite see yet and knowing that the moment they see it, it will seem obvious. And your job is just to hold the space until that happens. I live in a 2-bedroom apartment that had a 2nd bedroom I'd been trying to fill for 4 months when Suki answered the listing, showed up with a single box of things that turned out to be all her books, and asked if I had a preference about the organization of the kitchen, which I did not, and which she apparently did, because by the end of the first week the kitchen made more sense than it ever had. Suki Tanaka, 29, UX researcher, which means she spends her professional life designing ways to understand how people actually use things rather than how they're supposed to. Finding the friction points, the places where expectation and reality don't line up. The invisible gaps between what was intended and what happens. She had been doing this. I learned over 8 months of cohabitation. Not only professionally, but constantly. In every room she walked into, including ours. And it made her exceptionally good at noticing things that other people walked past. She noticed things about me. I noticed her noticing, and found, somewhere around month 3, that I was adjusting things slightly. The way I left a room, the things I left on the counter, the music I put on in the mornings, because someone was paying that quality of attention, and I had become, without examining why, interested in what she found. This is not the kind of thing you tell someone. I had not told her. The job offer had come 8 weeks ago. She had mentioned it at dinner the same night, casually, in the way she mentioned things she wanted to think through in the open air, not asking for a decision, just turning it over. It paid significantly more. It was a better title. The city was one she'd always wanted to live in. She said all of this, and then said, "But I like it here." And then ate her dinner and changed the subject, and I had spent the following 8 weeks watching her live in the apartment the way someone lives somewhere if they are trying to decide whether to leave. Slightly more present than usual, noticing things she usually moved past, as if she were making an inventory. I had been doing the same thing and had not known it until she came out of her room with the bag. 6 minutes of watching her move around the apartment quietly, checking that she had things, not saying anything. The bag by the door, the keys in her hand, the taxi 7 minutes away, then 6. Then she came and stood in the doorframe and said, "Unless," and stopped. I said, "Unless what, Suki?" She said, "I'm trying to figure out how to say it without it being..." She stopped. "Without it putting you in a position." I said, "What position?" She said, The one where you say something because I'm standing in a door at midnight and not because it's true. She looked at the door frame rather than at me. I don't want the door to be the reason. I said, that's a very precise concern. She said, I notice things. You know this. I said, I know this. She said, I've noticed things for 8 months. About this apartment and about... She stopped. About living here. And I've been very careful not to draw conclusions from the data because I know that living in close proximity to someone creates a particular kind of warmth that is not the same as... She stopped again. I'm trying to be rigorous about this. I said, how's that going? She said, not great. Something in my chest did a thing that chests do when they recognize something they've been waiting to recognize. I said, the taxi is now approximately 4 minutes away. She said, I know. I said, I'm going to say something. She said, okay. I said, not because you're in the door. She looked at me then. Actually looked, the way she looks at things she's examining properly rather than processing at a distance. I said, the morning you organized the kitchen, I came in and it made sense in a way it never had, and I thought, that's the kind of thing someone does when they're going to stay. Not because they have to, because they want it to work. I held her gaze. I've been thinking about that kitchen for 8 months. Not the kitchen. The thing the kitchen was. She was very still. I said, I don't know if that's the unless you were building toward. But it's a true thing. And you said you didn't want the door to be the reason, so I want to tell you it's not. The door has nothing to do with it. She looked at me for a long moment. Outside, somewhere on the street below, a car moved past. The hallway light hummed very slightly. She said, I changed the contact name I have for you in my phone. I said, when? She said, month 4. When you left a note on the counter about the milk, and the note was... She stopped. It was a funny note. It was a very small thing, and it was funny in a specific way that is particular to you, and I read it and I thought, oh. And then I changed the contact name. I said, what to? She said, without quite looking at me, Sam, the apartment, the milk, all of it. That landed in the midnight quiet of the doorframe, like something set down gently after being carried a long way. I said, all of it. She said, it was shorthand. For, she gestured vaguely at the apartment, at me, at the 8 months of kitchen logic and counter notes and a quality of attention going in both directions. All of it. I said, Suki. She said, the taxi is probably 2 minutes. I said, cancel it. She said, that's... She stopped. That's not a small thing to say. I said, I know. She said, if I cancel it, I have to make a decision. About the job. About... I said, not tonight. Tonight you just cancel the taxi. Everything else can be tomorrow. She looked at me. I could see her doing what she does, which is locate the friction points, find where the thing being said doesn't line up with the thing she expected. And then I could see her find that it did line up, that the thing being said was just the thing being said, without architecture beneath it, and that sometimes the friction point is that there isn't one. She took out her phone. She canceled the taxi. She stood in the doorframe for one more moment, bag still on her shoulder, coat still on, keys still in her hand. And then she stepped back into the apartment, one step, back into the dark. And she said, very quietly, I'm still going to have to decide about the job. I said, I know. She said, this doesn't... I don't want you to think this means I'm definitely staying. I said, I know that too. She said, I just wasn't ready to go. I said, I know. She set the bag down on the floor. She didn't put it back in her room. She just set it there in the middle of the living room, like a placeholder for a decision not yet made. She took off her coat. She sat down on the couch in the dark, coat in her lap, keys still in her hand. And she looked at the window, at the city being the city at midnight. And she said, Tell me something. I sat down. Not close, not far. The right distance for a conversation that hadn't decided what it was yet. I said, What do you want to know? She said, The kitchen. You said it was the thing the kitchen was. She looked at the window. What was it? I said, Someone making a place work because they wanted it to. Not because they were obligated, because they looked at something and thought, I can make this better, and I want to. She was quiet. I said, That's a rare thing. I noticed it. She said, I notice things too. I said, I know. I've been aware of it. She said, Aware how? I said, The way you register something, not just what it is, but what it means. The gap between what's intended and what happens. I looked at the window alongside her. I've been interested in what you found. She said, For how long? I said, Month 3, when I realized I was leaving different things on the counter. She turned to look at me. I said, I noticed I was doing it before I understood why. She said slowly, You were adjusting the variables. I said, I was adjusting the variables. She looked at me for a long moment with the expression that means she has found something she didn't expect to find, located the thing that doesn't match the model, and is deciding what to do with the information. Then she said, That's either the most honest thing anyone has said to me or the most mathematics thing anyone has said to me. I said, I teach mathematics. She said, I know. And something in her face let go, small, quiet. The release of something held with effort. She said, I was so careful. For 8 months I was so careful not to. I built a whole methodology for not drawing the wrong conclusion. I said, What was the methodology? She said, Every time I notice something, I ask myself, Is this the thing, or is this proximity? Is this real data, or is this the warm bias of sharing a kitchen with someone? She set the keys down on the cushion beside her. I had very strict controls. I said, And? She said, And the controls kept failing. That hit the quiet of the room like something true. I said, Suki. She said, I know. I know we have to be careful. About the living situation and about what we're saying and about, I said, Suki. She stopped. I said, The controls kept failing. She looked at me. I said, That's the data. She said nothing for a moment. Then she put her face in her hands, not crying. Just a person briefly covering their face because something has been said that is both obvious and enormous, and they need a second. Then she looked up and said, You're not supposed to be this easy to talk to. I said, I've been told that. She said, It's a design flaw. I said, Or a feature. She said, A feature. She looked at me with the directness she uses when she has completed an assessment. It's a feature. She stayed. Not just that night. She stayed. She called the company the following week and asked for more time to decide, and they gave her 2 weeks. And she spent those 2 weeks in the apartment in the particular way of someone who has stopped making an inventory and started just living. At the end of the 2 weeks, she turned down the job. And she told me not the night she decided, but the next morning, over coffee. In the kitchen that now made sense. because she said she wanted to tell me in a room that was partly responsible. I said, "You turned it down." She said, "I turned it down." I said, "Because," she said, "because the friction points here don't feel like friction anymore." She held the mug with both hands. "And because the data was conclusive." I said, "What was the conclusion?" She said, "Sam, the apartment, the milk, all of it." She held my gaze. "That's the conclusion." She updated the contact name 6 months later. I asked what she'd changed it to. She showed me. It just said, "Home." She said, "It's more accurate." I said, "It is." She said, "The other version was shorthand for something I didn't have a word for yet." She put the phone down. Now I have the word. A year after that, her colleague asked how she decided to stay, to turn down the better job, the better title, the city she'd always wanted. She said, "I ran the analysis and the controls kept failing. In research, when your controls keep failing, that's usually because the variable you're controlling for is real." Her colleague said, "What was the variable?" Suki said, "Someone who was adjusting the variables." Her colleague looked confused. I'm told Suki found this very satisfying. The bag is still in the living room. Not literally, we put it away, but in the sense that the unless is still there, on the door frame where she left it. The shape of the question she asked, and the answer we found together, and the particular midnight in which everything that had been accumulating for 8 months finally had permission to be what it was. Unless. One word. A sentence that changed its mind. It was the best thing she ever left unfinished. What would you have done if someone stopped at the door and said, "Unless," and waited for you to fill in the rest? And have you ever noticed yourself adjusting the variables for someone without understanding why, until suddenly you did? Tell me in the comments. If this one stayed with you, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.